The family stepped onto the plane with an air of quiet confidence. They were accustomed to traveling in luxury, and had done so countless times before, but today felt different. The hum of the bustling airports seemed distant to them. As they moved towards the gate, their two children walking just ahead of their parents. As the family made their way through the jet bridge, the eldest child, a teenager, scanned the interior of the plane with a look of mild interest. His younger sister tugged at her father's sleeve, excitedly pointing out the large windows and the bright lights that filled the cabin. The father smiled and gave her a playful ruffle of her hair. They had traveled often, but every time seemed to hold a new spark of wonder in her eyes. As they entered first class, the attendants greeted them with polite smiles, as though they had seen them 100 times before, but there was something different today. A subtle shift in the air that none of them could quite put their finger on. The family settled into their seats without fanfare. The father sat next to the window, his wife beside him, while the children took the 2 seats across the aisle from each other. There was an easy calm among them. As they settled in like they were at home, the children pulled out their tablets, while the parents engaged in quiet conversation, each of them in a comfortable cocoon of their own as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Unbeknownst to them, as they were lost in their own world, the flight attendants in the galley began to talk in hushed tones. The plane was not full, but it was busy, and the crew was feeling the stress of a flight that would be long and demanding. One of the attendants had caught sight of the family and instantly recognized them, though their faces didn't appear in the public eye. Often their name was a fixture in the airline's executive suite. She whispered it to her colleague with a touch of disbelief, but quickly dismissed it as coincidence. After all, the world was full of wealthy families who looked alike. The flight attendants continued their work, but a sense of curiosity hung in the air. The flight began normally enough, and the family remained calm and collected. They ordered a couple of drinks and settled in for the long haul. The younger child was quiet and engrossed in her tablet, while the parents chatted in low voices, exchanging stories of the week and planning for the days ahead. There was something about this flight that felt smoother than usual. Perhaps it was the sense of adventure or the anticipation of reaching their destination. They had no idea the turbulence that would come in the form of an unexpected confrontation. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the family continued to enjoy their peaceful start to the journey. But all was not well in the galley. The flight attendant, who had been walking the aisle since the beginning of the flight, was starting to feel a sense of irritation welling up inside her. She had been running back and forth between first class and the economy cabin. She had been asked to make extra rounds by her senior crew members, and with every step the pressure mounted. She felt it in her shoulders and in her hands, which gripped the cart with increasing tension. She made her way to the family's row with a tight smile on her lips. The father asked for an additional pillow for his wife, who had mentioned feeling a little uncomfortable with the seat. They had been traveling for hours, and she simply wanted to rest. The attendant's smile faltered for a moment before she replied curtly, "We'll see what we can do," her voice dripping with a cold edge that wasn't usually there. The father nodded politely, unsure of what to make of her response, but the tension in the air grew thick between them. It was only a pillow, but the way she had said it felt unnecessarily sharp. A quick look passed between the parents, but neither of them said anything. The flight attendant walked away, but something in her moved to anger. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about this family rubbed her the wrong way. As she passed by their seats, she muttered under her breath something that was barely audible, but unmistakable. The father's ears perked up at the words. Though he made no move to respond, his wife noticed his gaze and shifted uncomfortably, but they both remained silent, unsure of what to make of the sudden shift in energy. The flight attendant had made a point of showing them they weren't as important as they seemed to think they were, but neither of them knew just how wrong she was. The flight attendant felt her irritation bubbling beneath the surface. As she made her way back to the galley, her colleagues were talking in low voices, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about that family sitting in first class. Something about them had rubbed her the wrong way. It wasn't just the request for a pillow or the way they had looked at her. It was their demeanor, their air of superiority, as if they were entitled to everything. She had seen families like that before, always acting as if they deserved special treatment. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were just like the others, expecting the world to bend for them and it irritated her deeply. As she busied herself with the drink orders, she kept glancing back at the family, her eyes flicking toward their seats every time. She had a moment to herself. They seemed so composed, so self-assured, almost too perfect. For a moment she wondered if they had somehow been pretending to be just another group of well-to-do passengers playing the part of ordinary travelers. But there was something too polished about their elegance, too effortless in the way they carried themselves. Even their children were quiet and well-behaved, too well-behaved, as if they were used to the rules being bent for them, too used to being catered to. She sighed and focused back on the cart, trying to shake off the nagging feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. She didn't know why, but she couldn't stop herself from muttering under her breath as she walked past their row again, her words sharp and dismissive. Perhaps she had gone too far, but it was too late to take it back now. And besides, they hadn't seemed to care much about it. They just sat there, as if nothing had happened. Her mind was a storm of frustration. She hadn't been able to find a good outlet for it all day. The stress of the flight, her growing dislike of the passengers, the never-ending pressure to meet everyone's expectations in this high-class cabin. It all felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her, and the family in the front row had somehow become the symbol of all that had been building inside her all day. The flight continued as planned, but the atmosphere had shifted. The family remained calm and quiet, even as the attendant continued to glide past their row with forced smiles and clipped responses. They never made a fuss, even when their requests were met with cold indifference. The children seemed unfazed by the treatment, as though they were used to it, while the parents exchanged knowing glances every now and then, as if they could sense the subtle tension brewing around them. But they didn't rise to it. They didn't make a scene. They simply sat there like statues of grace and composure, unaffected by the growing unease. The attendant couldn't help but wonder if they were playing a game, if they were pretending not to notice what was happening, or if they were genuinely too aloof to care. By now the flight attendant was starting to feel the heat of her frustration turning into something darker. She had started making snide comments to herself under her breath every time she passed their row. Just little things that she thought no one would hear, but she felt a twisted satisfaction in it every time she whispered a sharp remark in her mind. She felt a small release of the pressure building inside her. Maybe it was a dangerous habit, but it felt good to vent, even in the smallest of ways. Maybe they wouldn't notice, maybe they didn't care, maybe no one would know, but she did, and that was enough for her, at least for now. As the flight wore on, she couldn't keep the feeling of dread from growing. She could sense something was off about them, something was different, but she couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, maybe it was the stress of the flight, but there was something about the family's calmness, their politeness, even as she continued to treat them coldly, that seemed to trigger a growing unease inside her, and that unease only deepened when she overheard a conversation between two senior flight attendants. As they discussed the family's background in hushed tones, one of them mentioned the last name of the family and casually dropped the detail that they were major shareholders in the airline. The words barely registered at first, but when they hit her fully, she froze. The blood in her veins went cold and her stomach twisted as the realization hit her like a freight train. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against rocks. At first, it didn't quite make sense. She had heard the name before, but it was just a passing reference. It couldn't be them, could it? The family in first class that she had been so dismissive towards, they couldn't possibly be the ones who owned the airline. Surely it was just a coincidence. Her mind raced as she replayed the conversation she had overheard, the mention of the last name, the quiet but firm tone of the senior attendants when they spoke of them. Something in her gut twisted. She had been rude to them. No worse than rude. She had been cold, dismissive, even condescending. And now the full weight of what she had done began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. She walked the aisle slowly as the realization sunk in. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, and the silence around her seemed louder. She passed by the family seats again, but this time she couldn't bring herself to look at them. She didn't know what to say or what to do. She just kept moving as if in a daze. The words that had slipped from her mouth earlier now hung in the air like an accusation. She could hear them echoing in her head, the sharpness of her tone. The little remarks she had made thinking they wouldn't matter, but they had mattered, hadn't they? Everything mattered when it came to them, And she had made the worst mistake of all. Her mind kept replaying the earlier exchanges. Every word she had said to them played like a movie on repeat. She remembered the way she had responded to the request for the pillow. She remembered the way she had barely concealed her frustration, and how she had let her irritation spill over in a moment of weakness. If only she had known, she thought, if only she had realized who they were from the very beginning, maybe she would have acted differently. Maybe she wouldn't have been so rude, but it was too late now. The damage was done, and she had no way of taking it back. As she walked further down the aisle, her footsteps felt heavier with each step, the weight of her mistake growing more unbearable. The family remained as they had been before, calm and composed. They had not acknowledged the tension. Not a single glance was thrown in her direction, as if they were unaware of the storm brewing inside her. But she knew better. They knew. They must have known. They had to have felt the change in her attitude. It was impossible not to, and yet they said nothing, as if they were simply waiting for her to realize her mistake. They were waiting for her to figure it out, and the thought made her stomach turn even more. The plane was nearing its destination, and the final preparations began as the attendants began their rounds to collect trash and prepare for landing. The flight attendant couldn't focus on anything other than the family in first class. She kept glancing in their direction, but no one made eye contact. No one acknowledged the tension. It was as if they were deliberately ignoring it. Or perhaps they were just too composed to show how uncomfortable they might have felt. All she could do was walk past them again, and again, her heart racing with each step, as if she were walking toward a confrontation she was not ready for. When the seatbelt sign pinged and the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing the descent, the flight attendant felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The flight was almost over, and yet in her mind it was only just beginning. The family was getting ready to disembark, and she knew that the moment they left the plane, everything would change. She had been rude to the owners of the airline, and now she was going to have to live with that truth for the rest of the flight. It felt like a slow burn inside her chest, a kind of humiliation she couldn't escape. As she walked toward the front of the plane one last time, she looked toward the family. They were quietly gathering their things, the children moving in sync with their parents, as if they had done this 100 times before. The father leaned over to whisper something to his wife, and the mother smiled warmly at him before turning her attention to the children with a practiced ease. They looked like any other family preparing to disembark, but to her, they were the ones who owned the airline, and she couldn't escape that fact, no matter how hard she tried. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendant's nerves were stretched thin. Each minute seemed to drag on forever. As she moved up and down the aisle preparing the cabin for landing, her thoughts were a jumble. She couldn't focus on anything except the family in first class. They were calm, collected. They had been so polite despite her behavior. But now she could almost feel the weight of their silence pressing down on her. She kept stealing glances at them, wondering if they were going to confront her, if they were going to say something. But nothing came, not a word from them, not a look, nothing at all. It was maddening. She had expected some kind of reaction, maybe a cold stare or a sharp comment, but there was nothing. They simply went about their business, as if everything were fine, as if she hadn't been rude to them in ways that now felt unforgivable. They moved with practiced ease, packing up their things and making small talk amongst themselves. The children were quiet, but not in a way that seemed odd. It was just their normal, calm presence. She had seen families like them before, but something about these particular ones felt different. Somehow it was as if they were untouchable, untouched by the normal rules that governed the rest of the world. The flight attendant's heart was pounding in her chest. Her palms were sweating as she tried to keep her composure, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep inside her. She kept trying to imagine what they must be thinking, what they must be feeling after everything that had happened over the past few hours. Surely they had noticed the tension. Surely they could tell that something was off. But still they remained silent. They didn't even look at her, as if they were above it all, as if her petty anger and frustration meant nothing to them. And maybe it didn't. Maybe she was just another insignificant part of their world, to be ignored like all the others who served them during their travels. But then something shifted. The flight attendant watched as the father stood up first, stretching his back. As he turned toward the front of the cabin, he didn't look at her, not directly anyway, but she could tell that his eyes flicked toward her for just a moment before he turned away. It was the briefest of glances, but it sent a jolt of panic through her chest. Her mind immediately began to race, trying to figure out what it meant. Had he noticed her behavior? Had he heard the things she had said under her breath? Or was she just imagining it? He moved toward the aisle with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the flight, his family following him without a word. It was as though nothing had happened. The plane was almost on the ground now, and the attendants were making their final rounds. The flight attendant stood at the front of the cabin, waiting for the family to finish gathering their things. She kept her eyes down, not daring to look at them, but she could feel them moving past her like shadows. They were so close, but so far away, and yet the tension between them felt like a thick rope pulling tighter with every passing second. As the moment for them to leave drew nearer, she knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She had made a mistake, a massive one, and it was hanging over her like a dark cloud. There was no way to fix it, no way to undo the damage she had done, but still she couldn't bring herself to apologize. The moment came suddenly. The family was standing and preparing to leave. They didn't look at her as they passed by, not even a glance. She almost felt relieved, and yet the emptiness of their silence hit her harder than anything else could have. It was worse than if they had confronted her, worse than if they had yelled at her for her rudeness. They didn't need to say a word. They didn't need to do anything at all. All they had to do was leave, and that left her with the crushing weight of her actions. She had been so careless, so cruel, and now she would never know if they had noticed or if they had simply decided to let it go. As the last of the family members stepped off the plane, the flight attendant stood frozen in place. Her hands were shaking slightly as she collected herself. She wanted to apologize, but the words never came. They were gone now, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge that she had crossed a line. She couldn't uncross a lesson learned the hard way, but it was too late to change anything now. The plane touched down with a soft bump as the engine slowed, and the flight attendants moved into their final positions, preparing to disembark the passengers. The flight attendant's mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She felt as though she were moving in slow motion, like everything around her had become distant and muffled. She had barely registered the landing, the seatbelt sign being turned off, or the usual announcements that followed as the passengers began to gather their belongings. She kept her eyes focused on the floor and her hands busy with small tasks, hoping that if she kept moving, no one would notice the weight of her guilt. The family was among the first to stand up as they made their way toward the aisle. The flight attendant could hear the soft shuffle of their feet, the quiet murmur of their voices, but there was no confrontation, no angry words, no sign of the tension she had been bracing for in her mind. They simply went about their business in the same composed manner they had all throughout the flight, and it felt like an unbearable silence. In the midst of everything else, she had expected them to say something, to give some indication that they knew what had happened, that they were aware of her rudeness, but they said nothing. The silence was worse than anything she could have imagined. She watched them pass by her, her eyes flicking toward them as they moved past her without a single glance. Her breath caught in her chest as the father brushed by, just close enough for her to feel his presence, but not close enough for him to make any sort of comment. The children followed quietly, their eyes forward, as if they were walking through some kind of fog, their faces blank, no sign of resentment or anger, just the same blank calm that had marked their entire journey. She felt her heart sink lower with each passing moment, the weight of her actions now heavier than ever before. The last to leave was the mother, who gave a brief glance in the flight attendant's direction, but it was nothing more than a fleeting look, almost imperceptible. It was as though she was aware but chose not to acknowledge it, choosing instead to remain quiet and composed. She didn't stop to make eye contact or say anything, just a small movement of her head that was so subtle it could have been missed entirely, and with that the family was gone. The flight attendant stood there frozen for a long moment before she exhaled slowly. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled slightly. The moment of confrontation she had feared had never come. Instead, she was left with nothing but her own thoughts, her own regret, and the unbearable weight of the silence. She watched as the other passengers began to make their way off the plane too, but none of them seemed to notice her. None of them seemed to pay her any mind. They all passed by in their own worlds, and the flight attendant felt a strange sense of isolation, like she was stuck in a bubble of her own making where time had slowed, and her thoughts were trapped with her. There was no escape from what had happened, no way to undo the damage, no way to take back the words she had spoken, the careless remarks she had made in her frustration. Now they were etched into her mind, and there was nothing she could do to erase them. As the last passengers filed off, and the cabin grew quieter, the flight attendant stood there for a moment, staring at the empty seats, feeling the weight of her mistake pressing down on her shoulders. She could almost hear her own voice echoing in the quiet of the cabin, the sharp words she had thrown at the family like daggers, and then the overwhelming sense of shame that followed her every movement. She had acted out of frustration, out of stress, but that was no excuse for what she had done, and now she was left with the consequences of her actions. The doors to the plane were sealed, and the crew began to prepare for the next leg of the journey, but the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside her, something fundamental had shifted, and she wasn't sure she could ever go back to the way things had been before. Every interaction from this point on would carry the weight of her mistake. She knew that she would never be able to look at a passenger the same way again, never be able to ignore the potential for who they might be or what they might represent. Even if she didn't know it at the time, it was a lesson she would carry with her from that day forward. As the flight attendant made her way back to the galley, she felt a strange sense of detachment. Everything around her seemed to blur, as if she were moving through a fog. Her colleagues were busy with their post-flight routines, chatting and laughing, but she couldn't join them. She couldn't bring herself to take part in their easy conversations. It all felt so distant, like she was on the outside, looking in. She stood quietly in the corner as the others spoke, but her mind was far away, lost in the whirlwind of thoughts that had taken over her. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the flight over and over in her head, every word, every gesture, every moment that had led to this feeling of crushing regret. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to dismiss the family without ever considering who they were or what they might mean. But now she knew the truth, and it was like a cold slap to her face, the realization that she had insulted the very people who owned the airline. It felt surreal, almost like a nightmare, that she couldn't wake up from. She could feel the weight of their silence on her shoulders like a burden that wouldn't lift. One of the senior flight attendants walked over to her, noticing her distant look, and asked if everything was okay. She forced a smile and nodded, but she knew the question wasn't about the flight or the passengers, it was about her. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her as they tried to read her face, trying to figure out what was wrong. But she couldn't bring herself to answer. How could she tell them what had happened? How could she explain the mistake she had made when it was too late to fix it? She just stood there silently, unable to speak, unable to explain the turmoil inside her. As the crew began to prepare for the next flight, the flight attendant continued to stand off to the side. She didn't feel like part of the team anymore. She felt like an outsider, disconnected from the rest of them. The others continued to work efficiently, moving through the tasks with practiced ease, but she couldn't focus on anything. It all felt pointless now. Nothing mattered, not the drinks, not the food, not the polite smiles she had given out so many times before. It was all hollow now, because she knew that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The reality of what she had done kept crashing down on her with every passing moment. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. She had been rude, she had been dismissive, and worse, she had done it to the owners of the airline, to the very people who held her job in their hands. And now she would have to live with the consequences, no matter how silent they had been about it, no matter how much they chose to ignore her actions. The truth remained the same: she had disrespected them, and there was no going back from that. As the hours passed, the flight attendant couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She kept imagining what might happen when the family reached their destination. Would they report her? Would they file a complaint? Would she lose her job? Would the whole crew find out about her mistake? Would they all know how badly she had messed up? She didn't know, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She couldn't stop herself from imagining the worst-case scenario. It played out in her mind over and over again, until she felt sick to her stomach. And yet, despite all the fear, she couldn't bring herself to confront the family. She couldn't face them and apologize. She didn't even know what she would say, how she would make it right, because the truth was she wasn't sure it could ever be made right. No apology could undo what had been done, and she knew that the weight of her actions would follow her long after the flight was over. It would haunt her in ways she couldn't yet understand. The crew began to clear out the cabin as the flight attendant remained lost in thought, her eyes scanning the empty seats. But she wasn't really seeing them. Her mind was far away, still trapped in the past, replaying the moments over and over again. She knew she couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep torturing herself with what-ifs and maybes. But for now, all she could do was stand there in silence and wait for whatever would come next. The next day felt like a blur. The flight attendant had barely slept the night before. Her mind was still heavy with the weight of the previous day's events. She could feel the tension in her chest every time she thought about the family and the mistake she had made. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but it lingered there like a shadow, following her everywhere she went. As she walked into the crew room that morning, she could sense the normal hum of activity, the chatter of the crew members as they talked about their upcoming shifts, and the excitement of new passengers boarding, but it all felt distant to her, as though she were watching from the outside. She knew she couldn't avoid facing the reality of what had happened forever. Sooner or later, someone would find out. Sooner or later, there would be consequences for what she had done, and she wasn't sure how she would handle it. When that moment came, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel, that she had crossed a point of no return, and that the weight of her mistake would follow her like a storm waiting to break. But even with all the fear and uncertainty, she couldn't seem to bring herself to confront it head-on. She didn't know how to fix what she had broken. The crew members were busy preparing for their next flight, as the flight attendant sat quietly at the table, her hands fidgeting with the edges of a magazine. But her eyes were distant, her thoughts were miles away. She overheard snippets of conversation around her, but none of it seemed to register. Her colleagues spoke about passengers they had met in the airport or the latest gossip among the crew, but she couldn't bring herself to care about any of it. Everything felt insignificant in comparison to the guilt that gnawed at her from the inside out. She tried to focus on her next assignment, but every time she glanced around the room, her mind kept drifting back to the family from the day before. It wasn't until later in the morning that things began to shift. She had been called into the supervisor's office. The flight attendant had walked in with a lump in her throat, unsure of what to expect. She hadn't been expecting much of anything, but there was something about the way the supervisor greeted her that set her on edge. The supervisor asked her to sit down with a quiet smile that didn't reach her eyes, and for a moment, the flight attendant thought her heart might stop beating. She waited in silence, hoping that the moment would pass, hoping that somehow everything would be fine. But the silence stretched on until the supervisor finally spoke. "We've received a complaint about your behavior on yesterday's flight," the supervisor said, her voice calm. But the words hit the flight attendant like a punch to the gut. The flight attendant's hands went cold, and her heart raced, but she didn't say anything. She just waited for the rest of it to unfold. "The family in first class," the supervisor continued. "They've expressed dissatisfaction with the way you treated them during the flight." The words felt like they were echoing in her ears. She could barely hear the rest of what the supervisor was saying. Her mind was spinning too fast to process it all. It felt like the world was closing in around her. She had been hoping that maybe they hadn't noticed, maybe it would be swept under the rug. But now the truth was out in the open, and there was nowhere to hide. She could feel the blood draining from her face as she sat there in stunned silence. She had been bracing for this moment, but now that it was happening, she was completely unprepared. She had never imagined it would come like this. She hadn't expected the family to say anything. She had assumed they would let it go, that they would forget about her rudeness, the way they had silently ignored her the day before. But it seemed that they hadn't forgotten after all they had noticed, and now it was coming back to haunt her. "We understand this was a stressful flight for you," the supervisor continued, "but we do expect a higher standard of professionalism, especially when dealing with high-profile passengers." The words were polite but firm, and they stunned the flight attendant. Sat up straighter, feeling the weight of them settle on her shoulders. The supervisor didn't raise her voice or show any sign of anger, but the disappointment was clear, and it hurt more than any reprimand could have. She had been foolish, and now it was all out in the open. There was no denying it anymore. The supervisor went on to explain that there would be an official report filed, and that the family's complaint would be taken seriously. The flight attendant was told to be more mindful in the future, and that further incidents would result in more severe consequences. But the words barely registered. She could barely focus on anything other than the sick feeling in her stomach as she sat there, her mind still reeling from the shock of it all. When the meeting finally ended, she left the supervisor's office in a daze. The world around her still felt distant and muted, like she was moving through a dream. The flight attendant walked back to the crew room, her footsteps feeling heavy as if each step carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. Her mind was racing, but it was all just a blur of confusion and self-loathing. She couldn't focus on anything. She passed by the other crew members, but they didn't seem to notice her. The normal buzz of conversation filled the room, but it was muffled to her ears. Everything felt out of sync, as if she were living in some strange version of reality where nothing made sense. She sat down at a small table and stared blankly at the wall in front of her, her hands shaking as she tried to calm the storm inside her chest. She knew that the complaint would only be the beginning. The supervisor had been kind but firm, and the flight attendant knew that there would be consequences. She had already heard the words in her head over and over again: more severe consequences if this happened again. And that was all she could think about now. What would happen to her career? Would she be pulled from flights? Would she be reprimanded again? Would this be the end of her time as a flight attendant? Or would they find some way to work with her and let her keep her job? The uncertainty gnawed at her like a constant presence in the back of her mind. The thought of facing the family again made her stomach churn. She had been so cruel, so dismissive of them, without even knowing who they were, and now the consequences were real and tangible. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done, and the guilt weighed down on her in ways she couldn't explain. She had always prided herself on being professional, on maintaining a sense of calm and courtesy, no matter how difficult the passengers or the situation. But now she had failed in the most fundamental way possible, and there was no escaping it. She had been rude to the owners of the airline, the people who could decide her fate in an instant, and now they knew it, and she knew it, and the thought of facing them again made her feel small and insignificant. She imagined what they must think of her now. How could she ever redeem herself in their eyes? How could she prove that she was better than the person she had shown herself to be that day? She had acted out of frustration, but that was no excuse for the way she had treated them. And now she would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of her career. The hours dragged on as the flight attendant tried to distract herself with the tasks at hand, but everything felt hollow. She went through the motions of preparing for the next flight, of checking supplies and making sure the cabin was ready, but she couldn't focus on any of it. She felt like she was on autopilot, her mind constantly drifting back to the family, the supervisor's words, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She knew that it would take time to find out what the repercussions would be, but the not knowing was the hardest part. It left her in a constant state of anxiety, wondering if today would be the day they finally pulled her from service, or if she would be given another chance to prove herself. As the final call was made for the next flight, she stood up from the table with a sigh and made her way to the jetway, her stomach twisted into knots with every step. She could feel the weight of the complaint still hanging over her like a cloud. She hadn't been expecting this. She hadn't been prepared for the fallout, and yet it was here, and there was no avoiding it. The passengers began to board, and the flight attendant went through the motions of her duties, greeting them with the same professional smile she always wore, but the smile felt forced today. It didn't reach her eyes, and she could feel the difference in the way she carried herself. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the day before, and the silent judgment she had faced from the family. She could almost feel their gaze on her. Even though they were no longer there, they had been so composed, so perfect in their silence, as if they had known exactly what she was doing, and yet had chosen to say nothing. It had been the worst possible response, and the best at the same time. They had not stooped to her level. They had not made a scene or called her out. They had just let her be. And that was the thing that haunted her the most. She had never felt so small, so exposed, as when they had silently ignored her. As the plane took off and the crew went about their work, the flight attendant continued to struggle with the silence inside her. The guilt, the shame, the constant ache of knowing that she had failed to meet the standard she had set for herself. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for sure: she would never forget the lesson she had learned the hard way. She would never again assume that the people in her care were just ordinary passengers. She would never again let her frustration blind her to the truth of who she was serving, because in the end, they were all important, no matter who they were, and every moment of professionalism mattered now more than ever before.